Now let's take a look at some of the specific structures and organs of the digestive system. And we'll start where ingestion occurs, which is the oral cavity. So the oral cavity is also commonly referred to as the mouth, right? And not only does it function in ingestion, but it's also involved with mechanical digestion, specifically mastication or chewing. And it also is involved with gustation, which is taste. So this is a sensory process that's obviously highly important during the process of ingesting our food. So the tongue is a major organ inside the oral cavity, and the tongue is actually a skeletal muscle, so it's under voluntary control. And the tongue is not only involved with placing food between your teeth while you're chewing, but it's also involved with the process of swallowing. The fancy name for swallowing is called deglutition. So the tongue is involved with deglutition. The cells for gustation are located on the tongue, so the tongue is involved with gustation or taste. And a non-digestive function of the tongue is that it's involved with the process of speech. The palate is referring to the roof of the mouth, and the palate has two distinct sections to it, the hard palate and the soft palate. So the hard palate is the roof of your mouth that is just behind your teeth, right? And then as you go further back, as you go more posterior in the mouth, we'll find the soft palate. And the uvula, that little dangly thing inside your mouth, the uvula is part of the soft palate. It hangs off the soft palate. When we look into someone's mouth, we can usually see some of the tonsils. So we can usually see the palatine tonsils. And the palatine tonsils are located on the right and left sides of the oropharynx. And like the other tonsils, these are organs that are important for defense against infection. So they are a lymphoid type tissue, so they contain lots of white blood cells that can mount an immune response to pathogens and kill off pathogens if they are discovered there. The two tonsils that you can see through the oral cavity are the two palatine tonsils. But additionally, we have other tonsils too. The lingual tonsil, which is found at the base of the tongue, and then the pharyngeal tonsil, which is found up into the nasopharynx. The pharyngeal tonsil is sometimes referred to as the adenoids, and they all help to defend against infection. When someone has their tonsils removed, it's usually the two palatine tonsils and the pharyngeal tonsil. The palatine tonsils are the only tonsils you can actually see when you look into someone's mouth. The other ones are too far down or too far up to be seen. Also involved with mastication would obviously be the teeth, right? So we have 20 primary teeth. These are also called baby teeth or deciduous teeth. Sometimes they're even called milk teeth. The 20 primary teeth are usually, but not always, replaced by 32 secondary or permanent teeth. And we have different types of teeth for different jobs. The incisors, right, which are our front teeth, those big buckers, right? The incisors are important for tearing and ripping, and that's also true of the teeth next to them, which are the canines or the cuspids. As we go a little bit further back, we're going to find our premolars, also called our bicuspids, and then behind those are the molars. The premolars and the molars have flat surfaces, which are good for grinding, so they're not so much into the tearing and ripping, but more into the grinding. And what I find kind of interesting is that when you look at the teeth of a human, you can tell that we are omnivores, because the incisors and cuspids are really important for eating meat, whereas the bicuspids and molars are really important for grinding up plant-based products. Enamel is what we find on the surface of a tooth, and it is the hardest substance produced in the human body. It is one of the hardest substances actually found on our planet naturally. And yet bacteria have found a way to degrade it, right? We have lots of bacteria in our mouth, and when we eat, they eat, and like us, they like their simple sugars. So the more simple sugars we eat, the more that the bacteria in our mouth eats. And the more the bacteria eat, the more they poop. And their poop is acidic. So the waste products produced by the bacteria in our mouth are acids, and they can actually eat away at the enamel on our teeth, and that can produce dental caries, which are also called cavities. Last up are the salivary glands. So the salivary glands are glands that are associated with the oral cavity. They're not actually located in the oral cavity. And they, of course, secrete saliva into the oral cavity. And saliva is mostly water and mucus, and it helps to lubricate our food, making the process of deglutition easier, and also helps to bind food together, which also helps to make deglutition easier. We do find some digestive enzymes in saliva too. Next up are the pharynx and the esophagus. So the pharynx is commonly referred to as the throat, and there are two parts to the throat that are involved with the digestive system, the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. The oropharynx is the throat that's just behind the oral cavity, and then inferior to that is the laryngopharynx. Not involved with the process of digestion is the nasopharynx. So the nasopharynx is found superior to the oropharynx. When we swallow, the uvula and the soft palate go up to prevent food from entering into the nasopharynx when we swallow. Also, when we swallow, we don't want food to go into our larynx and our respiratory system. So when we swallow, the epiglottis is going to fold over the opening of the larynx so that food does not enter into the respiratory tract. So when we swallow, we're actually doing things to prevent food from going up to our nose and down into our respiratory system. Once the food passes from the oropharynx into the nasopharynx, it next enters the esophagus. And the esophagus's job is just to move food down to the stomach. And like many different parts of the digestive tract, it contains muscle in its wall, and the muscle contraction in the wall of the esophagus pushes food down to the stomach. The esophagus meets the stomach at a sphincter called the cardiac sphincter. So sphincters are circular muscles, and they're often like doors or gateways from one area to another. And so the cardiac sphincter is basically the gateway between the esophagus and the stomach. And when the cardiac sphincter relaxes, the food passes from the esophagus into the stomach. You might have experienced a little too much relaxation of that cardiac sphincter. So if we have too much relaxation of the cardiac sphincter, the acidic food in our stomach can actually come back up into our esophagus, and we refer to that as heartburn. It's also known as gastroesophageal reflux disorder, which is commonly abbreviated GERD. Kind of associated with the esophagus is something called a hiatal hernia. So the esophagus tube actually has to pass through a hole in your diaphragm. So whenever we have a hole in a muscle, that can act as like a weak point in that particular muscle. So the hole in the diaphragm is called the hiatus, and it can become weakened. This hole in the diaphragm can become weakened, and sometimes what happens is the stomach actually moves up into that hiatus, and it's just supposed to be esophagus there. And if that occurs, we call that a hiatal hernia. So this can be very painful, and obviously you can have lots of problems with heartburn with that particular disorder.